Over the last 2 decades, the computer animation industry has exploded with growth. Part of this is the heavy use of visual effects, but that's not why we're here today. Although if that were what I was talking about, I'd advocate for the unionization of visual effects artists working grueling amounts of crunch time. What I'm here to do is take a look at the evolution of quote-unquote realistic computer animation in just the last few years. For the record, when I use the terms realism and real life, I'm intending them as within the context of animation's logic and rules. Like, if I call Toy Story 4 realistic, I'm talking about the way that they recreate light physics in the computer, having simulated an entire carnival's worth of individual light bulbs, and not the factor of toys coming to life. As animators have restructured and refined the tools that make computer animation possible, a new movement is emerging of more experimental, more significantly stylized animation, combining old and new tricks. We'll get to that in a minute. So, in the beginning, there was Pixar. Pixar has become the biggest household name in the game to do it because of all their money. No, but really, it's because they do their research and they go the extra mile. Like, okay, when they were testing and developing how to animate underwater for Finding Nemo, they ended up recreating underwater locations with, too much accuracy, to the point where it looked really uncanny and wrong for cartoon fish to be swimming around. They couldn't differentiate between the real footage and the animated footage.
We want you to believe that it exists, but we want you to also kind of feel that you're in a make-believe world.
What they opted for instead was stylized realism, where it's still really easy to see that it's not the real world, but with a lot of visual similarities to simulate it, because they still wanted realism, which is why they put hours and hours and hours into their research when trying to emulate the real world. On the same film, they photographed and dissected dead tropical fish in order to understand their anatomy, study their scales and the way light played on them. They invited marine biologists in to examine the fin movements they'd tested animating to see how believable it looked, from an expert's perspective. And again, they used filmed reference footage for emotive facial performances.
Neutral.
Excited. Angry.
Stern.
Sad.
And it's the same thing with these fish designs. We put enough eyebrow mass in there to really get the nuances of emotion.
They also keep inventing new tools and programs that facilitate the visual improvement of their films as computer technology gets more and more sci-fi. It's clear that their films have had a significant influence over the industry for several years. But we're not just here to talk about Pixar. This is the animation industry, not the animation company. And it wouldn't be complete without discussing other companies. Besides, you can't be the biggest name in the game without someone defecting to form a rival company. Dreamworks was the company that appeared to get humans down earlier, with Shrek. They focused on mannerisms, on scrunching the models, and they're practicing and improving micro-expressions. In this making of featurette, they also talk about underpainting, using multiple layers of color and texture on character models in order to combat the plastic look.
With Fiona, for example, we have a very complex system of dermis, epidermis, and base. So it's working almost like a makeup process, and that is a system also that was applied by Rembrandt, so it's not new. You basically don't paint one color straight. You paint a glaze of red, another of yellow, and then you have a base that reflects the light.
So Dreamworks is also, at this time, working on not realism, but believability by virtue of signifiers that audiences recognize and relate to. Physics as they apply in the real world.
Stuff that we see all the time and obviously take for granted, but in CG it's a whole nother story. And to make it believable, and not photoreal, because again, it's not what the story called for, but to make it believable as part of the world that we're creating.
You see that a lot with the improvements of cloth simulation like Shrek's tunic and Fiona's dress. Now, Pixar actually invented a program called Phys-T, which allows them to simulate clothing and fur, a necessity for Monsters, Inc., which came out the same year. Sully's fur would have taken forever to animate by hand, which was how most elements of the animation were being done in the early 2000s. Another major advancement in the evolution of computer animation realism would be ray tracing. So you place a light source into the virtual space, and you get the computer to calculate all of the reflective surfaces in that space that the light would interact with. You can really notice the effects of this between any franchise of animated films, but especially in Pixar's Cars, and you can also see the difference between Monsters Incorporated and Monsters University. Instead of an ethereal light source or two, lights are now actually in the quote-unquote physical space, interacting with the characters and environment. This is super prevalent in this scene for Monsters University, and you can see them adapt it for use in Inside Out too, where the character Joy acts as her own light source. Can you tell I did most of my initial research on Pixar films? Well, ignore what I just said, because now I'm going to talk about Sony Animation, technically more of a newcomer, but only by a few years. Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, I think, would be a big turning point for this studio. The investment and effort put into character exaggeration really pays off in this film, and I think it played a big part in the ways their next films would be animated. Getting the crazy poses that would originate in Cloudy and be prevalent in Hotel Transylvania involves a lot more reliance on traditional animation's uses of lines of action. You can see in the making of the director adjusting characters' poses to be even more dynamic, and the ways that they essentially redesigned the character models in order to accommodate that.
Murray Dancing on the Rock was one that was very heavily designed. We spent a lot of time finding funny shapes and really playing off the idea of his silly dance and summoning and what kind of like sight gags we could get away with in that one. We go as far as we can with the standard, which is, a character rig where we have controllers that are designed to move certain ways, but we can't be prepared for everything, so we've built a whole system called Tweaks where it actually becomes a whole other level of manipulating the character in the rig. It's essentially remodeling the character for each individual shape. And that's just, from one drawing, so an animator will get many drawings per review session.
Now, Sony would go on to make the film, which I would argue acts as one of the catalysts in the beginning of this new wave that I'm talking about, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Spider-Verse developed a ton of really cool style innovations while working on creating that graphic look, and I'm just going to run through a lot of them really quickly because I love it so much. All of the Spideys featured in this movie are styled very differently. Penny Parker is overtly anime-inspired. Spider-Noir is completely black and white and stylized like a noir detective might be. And Spider-Ham's movements and mannerisms are exaggerated in the same way that classic Looney Tunes is styled. For the most part, characters were animated on 2s while the camera was moving on 1s. Smear frames were used to create smooth movements while also harkening back to motion and action lines of comic books and of traditional 2D animation. But sometimes characters would move to being animated on 1s during pivotal moments, like Miles being taught how to swing for the first time. Sony developed a smart learning tool that would add drawn-on definition to the character models, based on outlining as done in comic illustration or 2D animation. Animators could go in and fix frames as needed, and the program would learn those rules to better render the rest of the film. Certain frames that the team wanted to pop visually were completely hand-drawn. In a comic, to illustrate a hit, you need to draw the impact, usually with onomatopoeia included. This film did the same thing using on-screen text to emphasize the hits. They simplified background elements in order to save time and room when it came to rendering the movie, but they did it in a way that looked good and matched the style. So, 2D paintings of commuters were placed inside of a bus instead of character models. Background traffic would be suggested using squares of light. They even painted little cubes in order to populate apartment buildings. And my personal favorite detail, they emulated misprinted ink in order to separate foreground and background. So characters in focus are colored normally, but the background might be a little fuzzier, like how comic books that misaligned in the printer might come out with weird, funny colored edges. For a lot of audiences, they'd never seen a superhero film quite like this before. But I had. The segment title is a joke, that's not really true, I'm just really bad at transitions. Dreamworks outsourced to Micros Images and Technicolor Animation and released Captain Underpants in 2017. This film isn't stylized in the same way as Spider-Verse, of course, but the animation in this film has exaggerated movements in the same ways as Hotel Transylvania, and because of the source material being half novel, half comic book, there are tons of action lines and little added-on, drawn-on lines for certain expressions. It's kind of like the missing link between animation pre-Spider-Verse and post-Spider-Verse, if that makes sense. What all of these films have in common is their desire to mesh 2D and 3D animation techniques together in ways that they haven't really been meshed before. You can clearly see that in Sony's next big release, 2021's The Mitchells vs. the Machines. When the world speaks, it rattles to me like all of the character designs were intentionally wonky, asymmetrical, and caricatured to really hit home the dysfunctional warmth of humanity and family, which is the message of the film. Using what they learned on Spider-Verse, they developed a sort of line art tool that gave characters an outline matching their coloring. The outline was affected by light and shadow and kept the characters looking illustrated to better contrast them with the robots of the film, who are sleek and symmetrical and move in extremely inorganic ways. They developed surface shaders that emulated the look of watercolor paint to contribute to that illustrated feeling. They also built textures for the natural environment and elements in the film that keep them looking like they were created or conveyed by a human touch, to further contrast them against the plastic and metal of the robot uprising and technological discomfort that Rick Mitchell feels. Again, my personal favorite part of the film is Katie Vision. Katie Mitchell, Rick's daughter and awkward film dork, appears to have drawn on several of the film's frames. She uses them to express her emotions, and they also include little inside jokes or stream of consciousness rambles that give more insight into her character, or jokes for the audience to enjoy. Now, I've sung Sony's praises a decent amount, but it's not just them who are doing work like this. In this trailer for Dreamworks The Bad Guys, which was released just a few days ago, you can see clear indications of following this stylistic movement. Graphic action lines are featured, as well as distinctive outlines during pivotal moments to accentuate the characters. And I might be biased, but I think it looks great. Will Pixar be contributing to this movement? Honestly, I'm not sure. It's not like their more recent films have been hyper-realistic, but even looking to next year's Turning Red, it doesn't seem like they're trying to emulate or build off of those visual ideas that I mentioned before. Their animation programs, now as strong as ever, can account for highlights on individual eyebrow hairs, and their characters have great movement, but they don't appear to be borrowing those graphic or comic aesthetic ideas. They might in the future. I hope they do. I think it's a really cool look, and I want to see more of it soon. Besides, animated films take an absurdly long time to make, and it's not like all of these films are a direct result of Spider-Verse coming out. That being said, Spider-Verse, and now Mitchell's, are great examples that animators and visual development teams can use to make the argument for branching out stylistically. In conclusion, I think it's very easy to see a growing trend of incorporating techniques learned from 2D animation, as well as comic book art and graphic aesthetics in these new computer animated films. I also think that Pixar played a huge hand in the evolution of computer animation in the last 20 years, and if they don't play as big a hand in the next 20, well, that's alright too, probably. Okay, bye!